After her husband's death, Queen Victoria fell in love again. But this time, not with a prince, and he wasn't the only one. Behind the velvet curtains of empire, 5 servants shared the Queen's most private world. They weren't nobles or politicians, just ordinary people who stood close enough to hear her heartbeat, and far enough to be forgotten by history. They dressed her, taught her, soothed her, even argued with her. And in their quiet devotion, they changed the course of an empire. So before we step into the candlelight, dear dreamer, remember, these stories take nights of research and centuries of silence to uncover. Don't just drift away. Subscribe, so the past doesn't vanish again. And tell me, what time is it where you are? Midnight in New York? Afternoon in Melbourne? Wherever you are, settle in, loosen the day from your shoulders, because we're going back to Victoria's private world, where loyalty whispered louder than power ever could. The year is 1864. Balmoral Castle, Queen Victoria's beloved Scottish refuge, stands wrapped in mist. The pines drip with rain. The deer move like ghosts across the moors. Inside the granite castle, the corridors are too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against the skin. The kind that remembers laughter and now echoes with loss. It's been 3 years since the death of Prince Albert, the husband she adored and, in her own words, my all in all. He died suddenly in December 1861. Typhoid, they said, and with him went the color of her world. Since then, the Queen has worn black every day. The mirrors in her rooms are shrouded, her music boxes are closed, and her servants have learned to walk softly. The court calls her the Widow of Windsor. And yet here in the Highland air, grief has found a new shape, not gone, but waiting. Enter John Brown, a tall, broad-shouldered Scotsman with windburned cheeks and an accent thick enough to frighten visiting dukes. He's a gillie, an outdoor servant, the man who guides hunts, tends horses, and knows every track between Dee and Braemar. He was first hired in the 1840s, when Prince Albert and the Queen began their love affair with Scotland. Albert admired him, practical, dependable, unflappable in bad weather. But after Albert's death, Brown is no longer just a face in the stables. He becomes something else, something Victoria doesn't yet have words for. He's summoned to Balmoral because the Queen, deep in mourning, has refused to ride, refused to walk, refused to live as she once did. Her doctors worry, her ministers whisper. They say she must return to public life. But she doesn't want the world, she wants escape. And escape comes wearing muddy boots. Brown arrives at the castle gates, his hair damp from rain, his manner brisk. He greets her with a curt nod. "Good morning, ma'am." Not your majesty, not my queen, just ma'am. Like a stable mistress or a neighbor's aunt. It's shocking, really. But the Queen doesn't correct him. She's too startled, and maybe, for the first time in years, amused. In the days that follow, Brown does something extraordinary. He tells her to get back on her horse. "Come, ma'am," he insists in his thick Aberdeenshire accent. "The pony's saddled. You'll breathe better out in the hills." She refuses, naturally. The air is cold, the ground is damp, the court would disapprove. But Brown does not care about the court. He waits outside until she relents. And at last, the Queen of England, in her black riding habit and veil, mounts her pony and rides again into the Highland mist. It is a small act, almost nothing, but to Victoria it feels like life returning to her veins. The wind bites her cheeks, the rain dampens her veil, and somewhere in the rush of hooves she remembers she is alive. John Brown is not an easy man to like. He's gruff, outspoken, sometimes shockingly direct. He tells the Queen when she's overworking, when she's being unreasonable, even when she looks tired. Things no one else would dare say. But she, who has been surrounded her whole life by flattery and etiquette, finds his honesty a rare comfort. He doesn't treat her like an idol on a pedestal. He treats her like a person, and for that, she begins to trust him. Her diary entries soon fill with his name. Brown is in great spirits, she writes. He is a remarkable man, so honest, so devoted, so full of good sense. It is the language of a monarch trained never to sound sentimental, yet between those lines hums something warmer. Brown's humor helps too. When she drops a glove, he remarks that even the Queen of England can't fight gravity. When she scolds him for speaking too plainly, he replies, "I wasn't born to whisper, ma'am." Against her will, she laughs. The sound surprises them both. In these quiet Highland days, the Queen begins to change. She rises earlier, eats better, rides farther. Her doctors note she looks stronger. She starts painting again, the hills, the deer, the clouds over Lochnagar. Even her handwriting steadies. And still, the rest of the world knows nothing of the small resurrection happening in the north. They see only the black dresses, the withdrawn monarch, the figure of grief. But up in Balmoral, far from the noise of London, a Scotsman with rough hands and a steady gaze is bringing her gently back to life. There is no talk of politics, no trace of court ceremony. He treats her as neither a queen nor a legend, just a woman who needs a good ride and a breath of air. And she, for the first time in years, allows herself to be simply that. When the day's light fades and the mist returns, Brown helps her dismount, holds the reins, and says softly, "Well done, ma'am." A small thing. Yet in those words, she hears more kindness than in a dozen speeches from ministers. In the Highlands, the nights are long, the stars sharp and cold. The Queen often walks the terrace before bed, shawl drawn close, watching the lights of the servants' cottages flicker across the dark. Somewhere among them is Brown, perhaps already asleep, perhaps still mending tack by the fire. She feels strangely at peace knowing he is near, not as a lover, not as a subject, but as a reminder that even the loneliest hearts can find company again. So the first thaw begins. The widow's grief loosens its grip. A fragile warmth slips in through the cracks. The queen of an empire whose name could make men tremble finds solace in the simple presence of one man who refuses to treat her like a relic. It is an unlikely friendship, born of rain and loss, stitched together by daily kindness and stubborn honesty. But sometimes, dear dreamer, that's all it takes to wake a soul from hibernation. A voice that doesn't flatter, a hand that steadies, and a heart brave enough to meet sorrow without fear. In the quiet of the Highlands, Queen Victoria rides again. The hills echo faintly with hooves, and somewhere in that sound, the world's most powerful widow remembers how to live. You might think that the Queen's heart, newly thawed by Highland air and the company of one blunt Scotsman, would be left in peace. But peace has never lasted long in palaces. By the time the leaves began to fall over Balmoral that first year, John Brown's presence was no longer just comforting. It was conspicuous. He was everywhere, walking beside her pony, standing at her carriage door, striding through the corridors with that unmistakable stride of his, as if the castle belonged to him. And in a way, it did. The Queen relied on him for everything: her safety, her schedule, even her moods. When she was anxious, he calmed her. When she was indecisive, he gave advice. When she snapped at ministers, he reminded her to eat. She trusted him more than any noble, more than most of her family, and infinitely more than her cabinet. And that was precisely the problem. Because in the hierarchy of Victorian Britain, there was an invisible wall thicker than any castle wall: class. Brown was a servant. He should have known his place, and his place was not beside the Queen of England, much less speaking to her as if she were a woman and not an institution. But Brown didn't care for walls. He had lived too long among the open hills to respect invisible boundaries. When he saw nonsense, he said nonsense. When he saw danger, he barked orders at guards, even at dukes. There's a story whispered through the corridors of a visiting nobleman who tried to walk beside the Queen on a path at Balmoral, and Brown simply stepped in front of him and said, "You'll walk behind, sir. Her Majesty doesna need crowdin'." You can imagine the look on that nobleman's face. Even more amusing is that the Queen said nothing. She simply smiled. To some, this was proof that Brown had bewitched her. To others, that she had lost her senses entirely. But Victoria, who spent her days surrounded by people who measured every word, found his impertinence refreshing. He was, as she once wrote, a very extraordinary creature. So honest, so faithful, so brave. Still, the court could not abide him. They called him uncouth. They said he drank too much whiskey. They said he was arrogant, insolent, and far too familiar with the Queen. Even his accent was considered offensive. To them, Brown was not merely out of place. He was a scandal waiting to happen. He began to acquire a nickname behind his back: the Queen's Highland Servant. Said with a smirk, of course. In London, the whispers grew bolder. "She has a man about her," they said, "a rough Scotsman, always near her person." And then, inevitably, came the cruelest label of all: Mrs. Brown. The first pamphlets appeared around 1866, cheaply printed, sold in the streets near Westminster. They showed the Queen, plump and veiled, arm in arm with a tall man in tartan. "Her Majesty's new consort," the caption sneered. Victoria, when told of them, was livid. "Disgraceful falsehoods," she wrote in her diary. But she could not stop the gossip. Even her own household began to rebel. Her private secretary complained of Brown's overbearing nature. Courtiers grumbled that he gave orders above his station. Some even refused to share a table with him. But Victoria defended him fiercely. When her physician, Sir William Jenner, hinted that Brown might be becoming too familiar, she cut him off. "He is the truest of my servants, and devoted to me," she said. "There is no cause for such wicked suspicion." In truth, the Queen was lonely. Albert had been her rock. Her children were growing, her ministers patronizing, the public distant. Brown spoke plainly. He treated her not as a relic or symbol, but as a human being. For that, she would endure the mockery of an empire. Still, Brown made it difficult for her to protect him. He had a temper, and he was fiercely proud. When servants questioned his authority, he shouted them down. When guards failed to show proper respect, he berated them in his thick Scots tongue. One witness recalled him thundering through the hall, booming, "I'll not have idle folk clutter in the Queen's house." It was said that the butlers scattered like pigeons before him. Victoria pretended not to notice. Or perhaps she found it endearing. In a letter to her eldest daughter, she described Brown as so rough and independent, but such a support. Then, in a line that made the family wince, she added, "He takes the greatest care of me and attends to all my wants." One can almost hear the collective gasp of the royal household reading that sentence. But to the Queen, it was perfectly innocent. She meant what she said literally. He attended to her wants, her comfort, her safety, her peace of mind. Brown was not always gentle, though. He could be blunt to the point of rudeness. When she complained of fatigue, he would say, "You're fine, ma'am. You just need less sittin' and more movin'." When she worried about her popularity, he told her, "If they dinna like ye, let them find another queen." It was the sort of remark that would have had any other servant dismissed on the spot, but not Brown, because she laughed every time. In Brown, she found something no courtier could give her: freedom. He reminded her of life beyond the throne, of her own stubborn, mortal self. He was not afraid of her crown, and that perhaps made her feel human again. But for every laugh, the gossip deepened. The public began to question her judgment. Why should the Queen be led about by a man who called her ma'am instead of your majesty? Why should a servant sleep in the anteroom beside her chambers? The newspapers called it a breach of dignity. Parliament murmured about it behind closed doors. Victoria refused to bend. She would not dismiss him, would not apologize, would not even hide his company. She wrote in her diary that those who spoke ill of Brown were base and malicious. In the summer of 1872, when an Irish youth attempted to strike her carriage with a stick, it was Brown who threw himself forward, shielding her, subduing the attacker in seconds. For this, she gave him a medal for bravery. But to her critics, it only proved their point, that Brown had too much access, too much power, too much of the Queen's favor. Still, she would not yield. When her ministers suggested she travel with a different escort, she simply replied, "Mr. Brown attends me always." That was that. The bond between them was something unshakable, unexplainable perhaps, but undeniably real. It was built not on romance, but on something rarer: the courage to speak freely and the grace to listen. So the court gossiped, the press mocked, the empire whispered, and the Queen, England's most private widow, simply went riding again, a Scotsman at her side, the wind in her face, and a faint, defiant smile beneath her veil. Because sometimes, dear dreamer, love, in whatever form it takes, isn't about who you marry or what the world believes. It's about who stands beside you when the rest of the world starts laughing. And if you've stayed with me this far, don't slip away like the others who forgot them. Go on. Subscribe. Let's keep their names from fading back into the dark. By the early 1880s, the Queen was an old woman by Victorian standards, nearly in her mid-60s, her empire vast, her children married off, her ministers aging or gone. But wherever she went, Windsor, Osborne, Balmoral, there was always one constant: the sound of John Brown's boots somewhere nearby. He had become part of her life's rhythm. In her journals, she no longer wrote Mr. Brown, just Brown, a single word, like breath. He was the man who fetched her shawl, corrected her posture, guarded her carriage, and scolded her when she forgot to eat. He was the man who made her laugh when courtiers made her furious. And he was, as she once admitted in her private pages, the best and truest-hearted man in the world. But nothing, not even loyalty, is immune to time. In the spring of 1883, Brown fell ill. A chill, they said at first. Nothing serious. The Queen fretted. She sent her personal physician, ordered his rest, even tried to visit. But he waved her off, saying he'd be back on his feet before she noticed. He wasn't. Pneumonia moved fast, and the Highlands were unkind that year. Within days, the man who had once seemed carved from stone was gone. The message reached her on a cold March morning. The Queen read it once, twice, then sat very still. No court announcement, no public mourning, just silence. The kind of silence that filled a room from floor to ceiling. She wrote only a few words that day in her diary. It is not possible to describe the blow, the loss of my best friend. The household held its breath. Ministers tiptoed around her. Her family dared not mention his name. They'd spent years trying to separate her from him. Now they were frightened of how much of her might have gone with him. For a time, Balmoral seemed to sink back into the mist. She refused visitors. Meals went untouched. In the evenings, she sat at her writing desk, the same one where he had once stood waiting for orders, and stared out toward the hills. But grief is a strange creature. It never comes the same way twice. When Albert died, it had been a tempest, weeping, wailing, black veils, curtains drawn. With Brown, it was quieter, more private, and somehow deeper. A few weeks later, she began to act, quietly, methodically, as she always did when the heart could no longer make sense of itself. She ordered a statue, carved in bronze by Edgar Boehm. It was placed at Balmoral. Brown standing as he had in life, cap in hand, eyes forward, protective, unyielding. At its base, the inscription reads, "Friend more than servant." No title, no years of service. Just that. Those 4 words would scandalize her family all over again, of course. But Victoria did not care for their opinions. She also commissioned a portrait of him, full length in Highland dress, proud and upright. It hung near her private rooms, where only she could see it. And on her writing table, she kept a smaller photograph, framed in silver. It is there still, in Windsor's archives, the Queen's own handwriting on the back. True and faithful Brown. She never replaced him, not with another servant, not with a friend. For the next few years, whenever she rode out, the space behind her carriage, the place where Brown once followed, stayed empty. People said she had gone mad with sentiment. Others said it was proof they'd been more than companions. The newspapers revived the old mockery, calling her obsession morbid. But history, for once, was merciful. The gossip faded. The Queen, by then too old and too weary to care, kept his memory like a private flame, small, constant, untouchable. On her desk at Windsor lay a small wooden box. Inside it, a lock of his hair tied with black ribbon. She had kept Albert's 2 decades earlier. Now, side by side, her 2 keepsakes of love and loss rested together, a husband and a servant, both bound to her story, both irreplaceable. In her will, she made a peculiar request that certain objects be placed in her coffin. Among them, a photograph of John Brown, a lock of his hair, and one of his handkerchiefs. It seemed a final act of defiance, or perhaps of gratitude. You can almost imagine the scene when they found it after her death. Ministers murmuring, children frowning, historians blinking at the audacity. But perhaps, dear dreamer, it was less audacity and more peace. A widow, at last, reunited with the only 2 men who had ever truly seen her. There's something quietly beautiful in that, isn't there? All her life she had been surrounded by symbols, crowns, scepters, titles, portraits the size of doorways. And yet when it came to love, she left behind only 2 mementos small enough to fit in a palm. For all the grandeur of empire, her story, like most, ends in something heartbreakingly human. She continued to visit Balmoral for the rest of her life. Every year, when she arrived, She would lay a sprig of heather at the base of Brown's statue and pause for a moment. Not long, just enough. Then she would move on, walking a little slower, her hand resting lightly on her cane. Even her diaries changed tone. The entries grew shorter, quieter, full of weather and memory. "Fine day," she would write. "The hills beautiful," as if the ache had settled into something like gratitude. And so from grief came warmth, and from warmth came silence. It is the pattern of every long life if you think about it. For the Queen, John Brown was not a scandal to be erased, but a chapter of her humanity. The proof that even a monarch can love beyond rank or reason. He had reminded her how to live once. In death, he reminded her how to remember. And yet, grief has a habit of changing its mask. In the years that followed, another figure would step quietly into her world, from a land far beyond the highlands, carrying not whiskey and rain, but letters and language, stories and sunlight. He would not replace John Brown, but he would awaken a different corner of her heart. Because grief, as Victoria learned, never truly leaves. It only changes its face. When John Brown died, the Queen told herself she would never grow close to anyone again. She meant it too, for a while. The statue at Balmoral stood as her silent promise, never again. She had learned what grief could take. But grief, as it so often does, is a patient thing. It never leaves, it simply changes its face. And one day, that face arrived from India. It was the summer of 1887, her golden jubilee, 50 years on the throne. London was in full performance, soldiers polishing brass, bells ringing from every cathedral, bunting in the streets. The empire stretched from Canada to the Cape, from the Caribbean to Calcutta, and every corner was expected to send its tribute. From Agra, in the heart of India, came an unusual gift, 2 attendants chosen to serve the Queen personally during the celebrations. One was tall and serene, with dark eyes and a quiet dignity. His name was Abdul Karim, 24 years old, a clerk in the Agra jail. He spoke English, wrote Persian, and, more importantly, carried himself like a man unafraid of emperors. The Queen noticed him almost immediately. Among all the courtiers in glittering uniforms, all the ministers bowing and murmuring, here stood a man who did not fidget, did not flatter, did not quake. He bowed deeply, yes, but when he lifted his head, he met her gaze without fear. She found it refreshing. He was assigned to wait at table, a role far beneath his education, but the Queen, always curious, wanted to know more. Where had he studied? What language did he speak at home? What did India feel like, smell like, sound like? He told her quietly that his city was full of marble and heat and mango trees, that the call to prayer rolled like music through the streets at dawn, that India was not only vast but alive. Something in her stirred, not love, not yet, but curiosity, that most dangerous of royal emotions. The Queen, who had once thought she'd heard all the accents of her empire, found herself captivated by the rhythm of his voice. "Would you," she asked one afternoon, "teach me to write in Hindustani?" Abdul Karim hesitated. "If it please your Majesty." "Oh, it pleases me very much," she replied. "I am quite tired of listening to Englishmen all day." And so it began, the most unexpected friendship of her reign. Each morning the two sat together in her study at Windsor. The room was bright with summer light and cluttered with papers, portraits, and inkpots. On her desk lay a small notebook, its first page covered in neat Urdu script. Urdu ka kitab, the Queen Empress's book. Abdul sat beside her, patient, guiding her hand as she shaped each looping letter. When she succeeded, he would smile and say softly, "Shabash, well done." She loved that word. It made her feel like a schoolgirl again. Soon she was signing notes in Urdu, peppering her letters with phrases of thanks or affection. She began calling him the Munshi, the teacher, and just as naturally, he began to call her Mother. Now, dear listener, if you think that might have raised a few royal eyebrows, you would be entirely right. Her household didn't quite know what to do with him. They'd grown used to Scotsmen in kilts, but an Indian in silk and turban, at the Queen's right hand, outrageous. Still, Victoria, who by now had outlived 9 prime ministers, didn't care for other people's outrage. She wrote in her diary, "The Munshi is a real treasure. So attentive, so intelligent, and so very handsome." You can almost hear the collective choking noise of the entire court reading that line. He began teaching her not just words, but ideas about Indian poetry, Mughal history, spices, festivals, music. The Queen, once confined by protocol, suddenly found herself transported. She imagined the Taj Mahal under moonlight, the scent of sandalwood, the hum of bazaars. At mealtimes she asked for curry to be served. Real curry, not the mild imitation her chefs prepared for diplomats. She even had special kitchens built at Windsor so Abdul could oversee the recipes. Her fascination was genuine, perhaps even innocent. But to her courtiers it was intolerable. They saw an empire bending toward one man. They saw a servant whispering in the Queen's ear. They saw, horror of horrors, the Queen writing in Urdu. Abdul, for his part, seemed unconcerned. He remained polite, gracious, and, most infuriatingly of all, calm. He carried himself not like a servant, but like a man who believed dignity was not something one borrowed from rank. And the Queen adored him for it. In their lessons, she confided things she told no one else: her fatigue, her loneliness, her frustrations with her children. He listened, always respectful, never pitying. He reminded her that she was not just the Queen, but his Queen. And in that subtle difference, she found comfort. It was, in its way, another resurrection, not of passion this time, but of curiosity. After decades of mourning and ceremony, the world felt interesting again. At Balmoral, she had rediscovered laughter. With the Munshi, she rediscovered wonder. And perhaps that is why she clung to him so fiercely in the years to come. He was not a ghost of Albert, or a memory of Brown. He was something new, a reminder that life, even at 70, still had surprises left. Her letters from this period brim with enthusiasm. "I am learning very fast," she writes. "The Munshi says I speak like a native," a claim one suspects that may have been made from loyalty rather than accuracy. Still, she cherished every word. When he was away, she wrote to him in halting Urdu, signing, "Your loving mother, Victoria R.I." To a woman surrounded by endless ceremony, Abdul Karim offered something profoundly simple: humanity without hierarchy. To the empire, he was a curiosity. To her, he was connection. And so the Queen and her Munshi sat together each morning, teacher and pupil, ruler and servant, 2 souls from opposite ends of the world, bound by ink and conversation. It was the beginning of one of the most unlikely friendships in royal history. And as their bond deepened, so did the murmurs beyond the study doors, whispers that would soon turn to fury. Because in the gilded halls of empire, nothing frightened courtiers more than a queen who chose to think for herself. You'd think, dear dreamer, that after half a century of ruling an empire and surviving 9 prime ministers, 20 pregnancies in her family, and at least 3 attempted assassinations, Queen Victoria would be allowed one simple pleasure: learning a new language with a charming young man from India. But no, because in a royal household, there is no such thing as simple. Every smile becomes a scandal, every gesture a report, every friendship a whisper. And so, when Abdul Karim, once a mere table attendant, began to rise in favor, the great machinery of courtly suspicion groaned to life. It began innocently enough. After the Jubilee, the Queen insisted Karim be given permanent employment in her household. She awarded him the title Munshi, teacher, and gave him rooms at Windsor Castle. Real rooms. Not a servant's attic, but comfortable chambers close to her own apartments. That, apparently, was the moment Britain collectively lost its composure. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was appalled. Her ladies-in-waiting muttered darkly over their teacups. The courtiers could hardly stand it. An Indian clerk, living inside the royal quarters, sharing private lessons with the Queen herself. Outrageous, unheard of, practically revolutionary. But Victoria, as you might recall, had never been particularly interested in the comfort of others. She wrote to one of her daughters, "I am very fond of the dear Munshi. He is so attentive and intelligent, and so good and gentle." Translated from royal diary speak, that means, "He's staying. Try and stop me." Now, dear listener, you can imagine the scene. Windsor Castle, a fortress of starch, lace, and stiff upper lips, suddenly had a young Indian man walking its halls, speaking softly to the Queen in Urdu, bowing slightly but never groveling, teaching her words like dil, heart, and dosti, friendship. The courtiers' discomfort wasn't subtle. They called him uppity, insolent, the black man in the Queen's favor. Behind their polished manners lurked something far uglier: racism. It was the late Victorian age, after all, a time when the empire could rule over millions of Indians, but could not imagine one as an equal. And yet here he was, eating at the Queen's table, riding in her carriage, walking with her through the gardens, laughing softly as he explained some new Hindustani phrase. She found his presence invigorating. "The Munshi," she wrote, "has brought light into my dull routine." She began referring to him in affectionate shorthand, M. She even sent him letters when he was away, signing, "Your loving mother, V.R.I., Victoria Regina Imperatrix, Empress of India." Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate how utterly exasperating this must have been for everyone else. Imagine being a duke, a man with 5 titles and 10 generations of breeding, watching your queen beam with delight as she practices her Urdu vowels under the patient gaze of a 20-something clerk from Agra. It was intolerable. And Karim, for his part, did not make it easier. He was polite, yes, but proud. He dressed elegantly, carried himself with quiet confidence, and never once forgot that he was the personal servant of the Empress herself. Some said he became arrogant. Others said he simply refused to play the obedient colonial. Either way, his self-assurance only deepened their hatred. Letters flew back and forth between royal households, complaints disguised as concern. One lady-in-waiting wrote, "The Queen seems infatuated. He behaves as though he were her equal." Another complained that the Munshi smells of curry. You see, the British talent for polite racism was already in fine form. But Victoria would hear none of it. She scolded her staff like a schoolmistress reprimanding children. "Mr. Karim," she wrote, "is most loyal and devoted, and those who speak against him do great wrong." When the household tried to restrict his access, she responded by giving him more. She knighted others who disapproved, but made it clear the Munshi was her chosen companion. At Osborne House, she built a special study for their lessons. She had him attend dinners, travel in her carriage, even accompany her on holiday. By 1889, she had granted him and his family houses, servants, and estates, an unimaginable rise for a man who, only 2 years earlier, had been serving prison records in Agra. The Prince of Wales, now fully alarmed, began sending discreet letters to officials in India, asking them to investigate Karim's background. When the reports came back spotless, courteous, intelligent, loyal, he was furious. "The Queen," he said, "is being taken in by an Eastern flatterer." But that was the thing about Victoria. She could not be flattered, only interested. She didn't need Karim to adore her. She needed him to remind her she was still capable of learning, of changing, of feeling curiosity after decades of grief and duty. He called her mother. She called him son. Their bond, though spiritual rather than romantic, was scandal enough for an empire still terrified of intimacy across color lines. And yet, through all the whispers, their friendship deepened. The Queen delighted in sending him letters filled with Urdu script. He responded with gentle poems of loyalty and prayer. They shared laughter over tea, over botched language exercises, over his cautious attempts to explain the intricacies of Indian etiquette to a woman who thought curry powder was a personality. She once asked him if Indian women were very beautiful. "Yes, Majesty," he said carefully, "but none as great as the Empress herself." She laughed, of course, delighted, not deceived. "Flattery, Munshi," she teased. "From you I shall permit it." It was easy to imagine she enjoyed provoking the court. For decades, her life had been dictated by duty, mourning, and ministers. Now, at 70, she found herself relishing a small rebellion. Behind every polite smile in Windsor, resentment simmered. Servants refused his orders. Lords plotted to have him dismissed. Even her doctors muttered that he was dangerous. But the Queen was unmoved. "I am very fond of my dear Munshi," she wrote in 1891, "and I shall not be dictated to in such matters." It was loyalty, hers to him, his to her. But it was also rebellion. A quiet, stubborn rebellion, fought not with armies, but with language lessons, shared meals, and the refusal to bow to prejudice. In her twilight years, the queen of an empire was being schooled by one of its subjects. And the irony was not lost on anyone, because somewhere in those marble corridors of Windsor, the Empress of India and her Indian clerk sat side by side, writing Urdu words about love, faith, and friendship, while the empire that claimed to know both of them was busy pretending it understood neither. By the winter of 1901, the Queen's handwriting had begun to tremble. Her letters grew shorter, her steps slower. The empire, vast, glittering, heavy, still bowed before her name, but her world had grown very small. And through that shrinking circle of light, one figure remained constant: Abdul Karim, the Munshi. He read to her when her eyes blurred, fetched her shawl when she nodded off, and murmured prayers in Urdu when pain kept her awake. She had written to him only days before her death. "I hope you are well, my dear Munshi. I miss you very much." It was the last letter she would send. When Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901 at Osborne House, the world paused. Bells tolled, cannons fired, telegrams flew across oceans. They said Britain had lost its mother. But in a quiet room nearby, a servant, once a clerk from Agra, lost something more personal: his whole purpose. Abdul Karim was among the last to see her face before the coffin was sealed. He wept openly. Few others did. Around him, the machinery of succession was already grinding into motion. Because, as every palace servant learns, love may linger, but loyalty dies with the crown. The new king, Edward VII, wasted no time. His mother's body was barely cold before the purge began. He had never hidden his dislike for Karim, the black man, as he once called him in letters. And now, free from his mother's gaze, he set out to erase him completely. The order was simple, brutal, and swift. Remove him from all royal residences. Destroy every letter, every note, every scrap of correspondence between him and my mother. Erase him. Soldiers arrived at Karim's cottage at Frogmore. They seized trunks of letters, diaries, gifts, all the keepsakes of a 14-year friendship. The Queen's handwriting, her sketches, her Urdu notebooks, gone, fed to the fire. Karim stood by as smoke rose, silent, humiliated. By afternoon, he was escorted from the estate. A single suitcase, no farewell audience, no pension, no comfort. He returned to India, to Agra, the city he had left a decade and a half before as a young clerk full of hope. He was 40 years old, disgraced, unwanted, his reputation a whisper. At home, he built a modest house he named Karim Lodge and lived quietly with his wife and family. He rarely spoke of England, except to say that he had served a great and kind lady. It was, perhaps, his only revenge, to speak of her not as an empress, but as a person. In his study, he kept 2 portraits, one of the Queen in her widow's cap, and one of himself, painted in London during their friendship. They faced each other across the room. He said they were still conversing. But history, that grand, forgetful creature, moved on. By the time of his death in 1909, Karim's name was a rumor, his story dismissed as a servant's fantasy. The court had succeeded. The Munshi had been erased from official memory, as though he had never existed. And yet, memory is a stubborn thing. A century later, in the early 2000s, his great-grandson opened an old chest in Agra. Inside were diaries, photographs, letters, the very pieces Edward VII had failed to find. Among them, a notebook filled with the Queen's Urdu writing, still clear after 100 years. One entry read simply, "The Munshi is a good, faithful friend. I hope he will never be taken from me." Reading those words now feels like eavesdropping on a heartbeat that refuses to stop. It's easy, looking back, to see their friendship as a footnote, a curiosity, a scandal, a sentimental oddity. But perhaps it was something simpler. After a lifetime of power, Victoria found someone who saw her not as a monarch, not as an icon, but as a woman curious, aging, lonely, still learning. And after a lifetime of being ruled, Karim found a ruler who listened. Theirs was not a story of conquest or romance, but of quiet rebellion, 2 people who dared to reach across the gulf of empire and call each other friend. Of course, empire doesn't like friendship. It likes hierarchy. And when Victoria's heart stopped, hierarchy won, but not forever. Today, visitors to the archives at Windsor may notice, tucked deep in the catalogues, a collection of letters once thought destroyed. In them, the Queen's familiar scrawl. "The dear Munshi has written again. He is so loyal, so kind. And in another, he is my best comfort, my true friend." It's a small victory, but a poetic one. The fire did not win, and perhaps, dear dreamer, that is the quiet truth of all human bonds. That what's written in trust cannot be burned. Not really. It lingers somewhere, waiting to be found again. When you think of Victoria now, don't picture the solemn widow. the marble-faced monarch, the empress in black. Picture instead an old woman leaning over a desk, tracing Urdu letters by candlelight, while her teacher waits patiently beside her. Two souls sharing a lesson in understanding. Because the empire might have been built on power, but her world, her private world, was built on connection. And though the court tried to erase Abdul Karim, the record of his life tells a different story. That kindness can outlive cruelty, and friendship can survive the fires meant to destroy it. History loves its queens and generals, its wars and treaties. But sometimes the truest history hides in the margins, in a line of forgotten ink, in a name that refuses to vanish. So, when you hear of the queen who ruled half the world, remember too the clerk who taught her how to say thank you in another language. And remember this: what is erased in life can be rewritten by time. Because, as the queen once wrote in one of her last letters to him, the bond of friendship, once formed, cannot be broken, even by death. But before Abdul Karim, before scandal and empire, there had been another presence at her side, a woman who never sought power, who asked for nothing but to serve and to stay. Her name was Marianne. London, 1837. The air smells faintly of rain and carriage smoke. The streets hum with rumor. The old king is dead, and in the echo of tolling bells, England has found itself a new monarch. She is 18, barely grown, barely steady in her crown. Alexandrina Victoria, Vicky to her governess, Your Majesty to everyone else. When she arrives at Buckingham Palace, her new home smells of mildew and mothballs. The corridors are dim, the servants stiff with formality. The throne she's inherited feels less like a seat of power and more like a chair that's far too big. The young queen, as she writes in her journal, felt quite frightened. And so, among the army of attendants, dressers, secretaries, and page boys, one woman quietly steps forward, a woman who, in time, will become more than a servant. Marianne Skerrett, aged 44, practical, sharp-eyed, calm as a still lake. She is appointed principal dresser, a position that sounds trivial until you realize that nothing in the 19th century monarchy is trivial. The Queen's wardrobe is an empire of its own. Bolts of silk, lace, velvet, feathers, fans, jewels, slippers, gloves, ribbons, buttons, brooches, all of it meticulously recorded. And it is Marianne's task to keep it all in perfect order. She oversees a small army of seamstresses and laundresses, signs off on bills from London's finest tailors, and ensures that every hem, every collar, every piece of ceremonial finery arrives precisely when it should. In short, she's the human version of an Excel spreadsheet 50 years before the invention of Excel. But what makes Marianne remarkable isn't her skill with fabric. It's her skill with silence. From the first day, she notices things other servants miss. The way the young queen smooths her gloves when nervous. The way she talks too fast when flustered. The way she glances at herself in the mirror as if checking whether she still looks like a queen. Marianne never interrupts, never comments. She simply observes and quietly adjusts. When the queen's new gowns are too heavy, Marianne has the lining altered. When the gold thread irritates her skin, she swaps it for softer silk. When the queen complains that her gloves squeak during audiences, Marianne replaces them before morning, wordlessly. Within weeks, Victoria begins to rely on her, not just for wardrobe matters, but for everything. Because in a palace full of opinions, Marianne offers the rarest luxury, someone who listens. There are diary notes that hint at this closeness. The queen once wrote, Miss Skerrett is so clever and composed. She keeps everything in such excellent order. And in later years, I rely upon her greatly. She is most devoted and always knows what is best done. Now, that may sound like bureaucratic praise, but in Victorian royal language, that's basically, I can't function without her. Skerrett becomes her quiet constant, the one presence who doesn't try to impress, instruct, or manipulate. When the Queen quarrels with her ministers, when her family overwhelms her, when her emotions spill into those famous diary pages, Skerrett is there in the background, quietly folding a shawl, arranging a jewel box, or offering a cup of tea that says more than words ever could. The other servants call her the Shadow, not because she's ghostly, but because she's always there, discreet, dependable, impossible to notice until you realize she's the only one who hasn't left. And perhaps, dear dreamer, that's why the Queen trusted her so completely. In a world where everyone wanted something, influence, money, favor, status, Marianne wanted only to do her work well. You can almost picture it. The young Queen pacing before a mirror, nerves tight before an audience with the Prime Minister saying, "Do I look quite proper, Miss Skerrett?" And Marianne, pins in her mouth, answering softly, "Quite proper, ma'am. The world will see you as you wish to be seen." And that was her gift. She didn't just dress the Queen, she helped her wear her confidence. The relationship between them grew in those early years. Victoria would sometimes invite her to sit while she wrote letters, an honor rarely granted to anyone not born noble. On quieter evenings, she'd ask Marianne to read aloud from novels or to comment on a painting or sketch. Marianne read widely, thought deeply, and spoke sparingly, the perfect conversational companion for a queen who, despite her royal command, never quite escaped loneliness. It's said that Victoria could be tempestuous, quick to anger, fiercely sensitive, but Skerrett's presence steadied her. When tempers flared, Marianne's calm was like a well-tailored seam, invisible but holding everything together. The Queen's early reign was full of chaos, political crises, court intrigues, the balancing act between youth and authority. Yet behind the scenes, there was always that steady hum of routine, the dresser's quiet knock, the rustle of fabric, the calm, practical voice that said, "It will all be ready, ma'am." In many ways, Marianne Skerrett was the palace's heartbeat, unseen but essential. And though her name rarely appears in history books, her influence lingers in the texture of Victoria's reign itself. Because before the great loves and scandals, before Albert, before Brown, before the Munshi, there was Skerrett, anchoring the young Queen in order, precision, and simple devotion. Perhaps that's why Victoria kept her close for 25 years, longer than most ministers, longer than some of her own friendships. And when, later in life, the Queen looked back on her early reign, she wrote of Skerrett, "She was quite a superior person, very clever, read enormously, and had great taste," which in royal terms is the equivalent of calling someone family. So, in this chapter of the Queen's story, the drama is smaller. No scandal, no rebellion, no empire in crisis, just the steady rhythm of trust between two women, one born to rule, the other born to serve, both navigating the same lonely corridors. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the faint whisper of fabric, the clink of buttons, the gentle murmur of friendship hidden beneath formality. Because history often remembers the loudest people, but sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones who fold the gowns, close the doors, and listen without judgment, who keep everything from unraveling. And for the young Queen Victoria, in those first uncertain years, Marianne Skerrett was exactly that. The seamstress of her secrets, the calm amid her chaos, and the quiet proof that even queens need someone who simply stays. And if you've stayed this far too, don't slip away like the rest of history did. Go on, subscribe, before stories like hers fade back into silence. Trust, dear dreamer, is a delicate fabric. It's not woven from grand gestures or royal decrees, but from the tiny, invisible stitches that hold a life together. By the early 1840s, Queen Victoria had learned this truth, though perhaps not from her ministers or her family, but from the quiet woman who stood behind her each morning with a handful of pins and a steady pair of hands. Marianne Skerrett had now been her dresser for several years. In that time, she had become less like staff and more like gravity, always there, unseen, but holding everything in place. The young queen, once nervous and uncertain, was growing into her crown. She was now a wife, soon a mother, and, increasingly, a woman the world expected to be both ruler and ideal. It was a heavy ask for someone barely in her 20s, and through it all, there was Marianne. Each morning began with the same gentle ritual, the rustle of fabric, the faint clink of buttons, the sound of the Queen's voice, bright, nervous, full of energy. Marianne's replies were few but perfectly chosen. A soft, "Yes, ma'am," here. A gentle, "Perhaps the blue velvet, ma'am," there. Words as precise as her stitches. When the Queen fidgeted before audiences or fretted over speeches, Marianne would pause, pins in hand, and say quietly, "It will all go well, ma'am." And somehow it always did. Skerrett had the rare talent of making herself both indispensable and invisible, the perfect paradox for royal service. Over time, their relationship deepened. The Queen began asking her to do more than dress her. She trusted her with letters, small errands, even diplomacy of the most delicate kind. Marianne managed the private correspondence that Victoria couldn't entrust to secretaries. When an artist or dressmaker overstepped, Marianne was the one who wrote polite but firm notes of correction. When courtiers squabbled over precedence, she made quiet suggestions that often saved days of embarrassment. There's something quietly impressive about that. A woman of modest birth running interference for an empire. One ribbon, one letter, one sigh at a time. Victoria once wrote that, "Miss Skerrett is invaluable, always composed, always kind." Now, coming from a monarch who once called her own children tiresome, that was practically a love letter. Their bond was built on small, unspoken acts. When the Queen suffered morning sickness during her first pregnancy, it was Marianne who mixed her tonics and sat with her until the nausea passed. When Albert complained that the palace felt disordered, it was Marianne who oversaw the household lists to spare the Queen another quarrel. And when Victoria, still so young, endured the grief of losing her mother, it was Marianne who stayed up through the night, reading aloud softly from a book of prayers until the Queen drifted into exhausted sleep. In those moments, the boundaries between monarch and servant blurred, not in impropriety, but in affection. It was not the love of equals, but of familiarity, the kind that grows quietly, like ivy climbing a wall. The palace around them buzzed with ceremony and politics, but their companionship remained refreshingly ordinary. They spoke of fabrics, books, artists, sometimes even the absurdity of fashion. "Far too many feathers, ma'am," Marianne would murmur, and the Queen would snort in agreement. There was comfort in that ordinariness. a small rebellion against the constant theater of monarchy. And Skerrett, for all her composure, had a dry wit that the Queen adored. Once, when a visiting duchess declared that a lady's dignity is measured by her jewels, Marianne whispered, "Then, ma'am, you must be the most dignified woman in Europe by now." The Queen laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. Moments like that didn't appear in official diaries. They happened in the unseen spaces, between corset ties and curtain calls, in the lull between one royal engagement and the next. As the years went on, their rhythm became second nature. The Queen would gesture. Marianne would already know what she meant. The Queen would fret about a letter. Marianne would have the reply drafted. The Queen would sigh, "Oh, I cannot face another dinner." And Marianne would say, "Then we shall wear something that makes it bearable." It wasn't glamour. It was grace. And through engagements, births, celebrations, and losses, she remained the one constant thread. When Prince Albert entered the scene, young, handsome, full of plans, even he came to respect Miss Skerrett's quiet efficiency. He called her the steady one. There's something remarkable about that. A woman with no title commanding the respect of kings and princes without ever raising her voice. When the Queen traveled to Windsor, Osborne, Balmoral, Marianne traveled too. She packed the royal trunks, kept the accounts, ensured that every petticoat and ribbon was precisely where it should be. And still, she never lost her composure. It's tempting to imagine her sometimes pausing at a window, looking out over the palace gardens, amused by the whirl of aristocracy that surrounded her, all that pomp and posture, while she, the practical one, held the threads of it all together. Theirs was a relationship built not on grand declarations, but on rhythm, the daily ritual of shared duty, of quiet understanding. In her journals, Victoria's words about Marianne never changed tone. They remained steady, warm, grateful. And that constancy says everything. The Queen, who could be mercurial, sharp, sometimes unkind, never once spoke ill of Miss Skerrett. Not once. Because she didn't have to. Marianne was her anchor. And in a palace filled with politics and pretense, that kind of loyalty is its own kind of love. No fireworks, no scandal, no whispered rumors, just years of mornings and evenings stitched together by trust. So when you picture Queen Victoria in those early, glittering years of her reign, don't imagine only the grand portraits or the solemn crown. Imagine instead the quiet scene that played out behind the closed doors, the soft rustle of silk, the gentle click of scissors, the calm voice saying, "It's all ready, ma'am," and a young queen smiling faintly in the mirror because she knows it's true. For all her power, all her titles, all her jewels, the Queen was still a woman who needed to be seen, understood, and cared for. And Marianne Skerrett, with her endless patience and tidy handwriting, gave her exactly that. 2 women, 1 crown, and 1,000 tiny acts of faith. Threads of trust, invisible but unbreakable. There's a peculiar sort of heartbreak that doesn't come with noise. No crying, no scandal, no collapse. It's the heartbreak of routine ending quietly, like a candle that burns out just as dawn begins. By the early 1860s, the Queen had ruled for more than 2 decades. The empire had grown, the family had multiplied, and the years, always too busy, too full, had started to fold into one another. And through it all, Miss Marianne Skerrett remained where she had always been. Steady, composed, efficient, invisible in the best way possible. But time, even in palaces, has a way of wearing through the fabric. After 25 years of service, Marianne was nearing 70. Her hair had turned white. Her hands, once so quick with thread, were beginning to tremble. Her eyesight, she joked, had become as poor as the laundry-maid's excuses. The Queen laughed at that, but behind the laughter she saw what was coming. The doctor advised rest, lighter duties. Marianne, ever practical, decided it was time. "Your Majesty," she said one spring morning, her voice as gentle as always, "I believe I should retire." The Queen froze. Retire? The word felt foreign, like a language she didn't speak. Victoria's instinct, of course, was to forbid it, to declare that Miss Skerrett was indispensable, irreplaceable, too valuable to let go. But Marianne, in her usual quiet way, had already arranged everything. She would move to Marylebone, to live with her sister Albinia, close enough to London to visit, but far enough to rest. And so, after a quarter-century of daily service, the woman who had once dressed a nervous teenager now stood before a queen, older, wiser, crowned and confident, and said her goodbyes. There was no grand farewell, no ceremony, no weeping crowd, just two women in a private chamber, one folding her last gown, the other trying not to speak. "Miss Skerrett," the Queen said finally, "I shall never forget all that you have done for me." Marianne smiled, curtsied, and said, "That is all the thanks I could ever wish for, ma'am." She left the palace quietly, as she had lived within it, without fuss, without vanity, and without ever once forgetting who she was. The Queen, true to her word, ensured she received a generous pension, a sum that would allow her comfort and independence, the two things she had earned more than anyone. And for the next 25 years, the letters continued. At first they were full of details: health, news of the household, the weather. Then they became shorter, simpler, affectionate. "It has been so dull without you," the Queen wrote. "No one is quite like my dear Miss Skerrett." Occasionally, a parcel would arrive at the palace, a small handkerchief embroidered delicately with the Queen's initials, or a note of congratulations after a royal wedding. Each time Victoria smiled at the familiar handwriting. In those years, life went on. The Queen grew older, more reclusive, more surrounded by servants who came and went. Some were capable, others tiresome, but none quite understood her the way Marianne had. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from being known too well, from realizing the one person who could predict your size, your moods, your small human flaws, has gone. When word came in 1887 that Miss Skerrett had died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 94, the Queen did what she always did with grief. She wrote, "She came to me at my accession and was most useful at the head of my wardrobe, ordering everything. She was quite a superior person, very clever, read enormously. I miss her much." No tears on the page, just the same restrained prose that always meant more than it said. But for Victoria, who rarely spoke her emotions aloud, those last 3 words were an earthquake. I miss her much. That was the Queen's version of "I loved her deeply." Her servants noticed that for several days the Queen worked in silence. She spent long hours in her dressing room, the one where Marianne had so often hovered, touching fabrics, running her fingers across the neat rows of ribbons and lace. One attendant swore he heard her murmur, "Everything's still as she left it." It wasn't grief like she'd felt for Albert or Brown or anyone else. This was gentler, quieter, like the soft ache that lingers after a favorite song fades. Because Marianne hadn't left a void of passion or excitement. She'd left a void of order. the absence of the person who made life smooth, predictable, safe. Even as the Queen's world filled with new attendants and ladies, she occasionally spoke of "Dear Miss Skerrett," always with warmth. It was as if, somewhere in the back of her mind, she still expected to hear the soft knock on her chamber door and the familiar voice saying, "It's all ready, ma'am." For a woman who had endured so many loud departures, deaths, scandals, betrayals, Skerrett's quiet exit was, in its way, the most tender. A lifetime woven in silence, each stitch a memory. You see, Marianne had never needed to be remembered by history. She had been remembered by the one person who mattered most, and in that she achieved something rare: immortality through trust. History may not give her marble statues or bronze plaques, but her legacy is still there. In the calm confidence of a young queen who learned how to carry herself with grace, and in the older queen who, decades later, still missed the sound of her dresser's voice. So, when you think of Queen Victoria's vast empire, its parades, palaces, and politics, remember that it was also held together by smaller things. The rhythm of a loyal hand folding a gown, the unspoken understanding between two women who knew their places and found peace in them. In the end, the world called her Majesty Empress of India, but behind closed doors, she was simply ma'am, and Miss Skerrett was the one who made sure the crown never slipped. It's comforting, isn't it? The idea that loyalty doesn't need to be loud, that love doesn't always need to be declared. Sometimes it just lingers quietly, like the scent of lavender on an old sleeve. And so, as the Queen laid down her pen that evening, she whispered one final thought, too soft for her diary, but perhaps loud enough for the walls to hear. "Good night, Miss Skerrett." But before Skerrett's calm, before the crown, there was another woman, one who shaped the Queen herself, who taught her how to stand alone, and how it felt to be left. Her name was Louise Lehzen. Before there were palaces filled with courtiers and whispers of empire, there was a lonely little girl in a too-big house. The year is 1820-something, and the place is Kensington Palace, not the glittering royal residence you might imagine, but a drafty, echoing old building with damp corners and a faint smell of coal smoke and caution. In one of its upper rooms, behind locked doors and watchful eyes, lives a small girl with large, curious eyes, and a name longer than her bedtime stories: Alexandrina Victoria. She is fifth in line to the throne, not important enough to be free, but far too important to be normal. Her world is ruled by something called the Kensington system, which sounds like an instruction manual, but feels more like a punishment. Created by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's advisor, the ever-ambitious Sir John Conroy, it is a strict regime designed to control every hour, every breath, every friendship of the young princess's life. She may never sleep alone. She may never walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. She may never play with children her age who haven't been approved. Her reading, her meals, her exercise, all of it monitored, logged, and corrected. It's less a childhood and more a royal training experiment. Imagine being 8 years old and realizing you're not a person so much as a future institution. And yet, amid the suffocating order and the endless no's, there is one small crack of light: a woman from Hanover named Louise Lehzen. Lehzen was no ordinary governess. She had come to England years earlier as a tutor to Victoria's half-sister Feodora, and when that duty ended, she was kept on as a companion for the young princess. Officially, she was Madame Lehzen, governess to the household. Unofficially, she was the only adult who treated Victoria as a human being. She was stern, unimaginably so. Her rules made the Bible look lenient. She expected perfect grammar, impeccable posture, and handwriting so neat it could have been engraved. But unlike the Duchess or Sir John, Lehzen's discipline wasn't cruel. It came with fairness, patience, and, most dangerously of all, affection. She didn't scold the girl for asking questions. She didn't ignore her when she cried. And when Victoria felt trapped, as she often did, Lehzen was the one who quietly whispered, "You must learn to be strong, mein kind. Even in a cage, a bird may sing." That sentence stayed with her for life. It said that Victoria's attachment to Lehzen began one afternoon when she fell during a lesson and scraped her knee. The Duchess, ever distant, ordered a servant to fetch a bandage. Lehzen, however, went to her directly, lifted her onto her lap, and kissed the bruise. "There, my darling, courage." It was the first time anyone had ever comforted her without formality. From that moment on, Lehzen was not just governess, she was guardian angel. The two spent nearly every waking hour together. They read Shakespeare and the Bible aloud, practiced French verbs, wrote diary entries, and discussed history. When Victoria grew tired of lessons, Lehzen let her sketch instead. "Creativity," she said, "is another form of discipline." Even playtime had its rhythm. Lehzen oversaw every doll, every toy, every outing in Kensington Gardens. And while the other adults treated the princess like porcelain, Lehzen treated her like a person who would someday need to stand alone. She taught her not to flinch, not to whine, not to let her mother's ambitions define her. "Courage and honesty," she would say in her thick German accent. "These, Highness, are better jewels than rubies." Victoria adored her for it, but their bond was not without friction. Lehzen could be fiercely protective, perhaps too much so. She distrusted Conroy, saw through his ambition, and quietly worked to shield the princess from his influence. She would intercept notes, stall meetings, even lie if it meant keeping Conroy away. And Conroy, in turn, despised her. He called her that old witch, the German spy, the poisoner of the child's mind. The Duchess, influenced by Conroy, began to see Lehzen as a rival, but Victoria, now in her teens and increasingly aware of her own importance, clung tighter to her governess. One could almost say Lehzen raised the Queen's defiance before the crown ever touched her head. When Conroy tried to force Victoria to sign a document making him her official secretary, she refused outright, trembling, pale, but firm. "I will not," she said. "I shall wait until I am queen." Lehzen was standing just behind her, silent but steady. Years later, Victoria would recall that moment and say, "It was Lehzen who gave me courage." The Kensington years were long, repetitive, and lonely, but they forged something in the young princess, a stubborn self-possession, an independence wrapped in gentleness. And at the center of that transformation was Lehzen, not the warm comfort of a friend, but the steel guidance of a second mother. At night, when Victoria was finally allowed to sleep, always under supervision, of course, Lehzen would sit nearby with her knitting, humming softly in German hymns. The sound became Victoria's lullaby, the rhythm of needles clicking, the faint melody of faith. To a child who had never known freedom, that quiet companionship was everything. It's easy to overlook Lehzen in the grand sweep of history. No portraits in marble, no royal titles, just a governess, middle-aged, strict, dressed in black, her hair pinned without vanity. But in the story of Queen Victoria, Lehzen is the foundation. Before there was confidence, there was correction. Before there was power, there was patience. And before there was a monarch, there was a small girl in a locked palace, learning, slowly, painfully, how to become herself. It's ironic, really. The woman hired to control her ended up teaching her how to resist control. Lehzen's affection was both shelter and cage, loving but demanding. She was Victoria's mirror, reflecting strength but never softness. And yet, the Queen would later write that she owed her all that is good in me. If that sounds grand, it's because it was. Without Lehzen, there might never have been a Victoria strong enough to rule. And so, behind every queenly gesture, every firm word, every act of self-possession in later life, you can almost hear Lehzen's voice echoing softly. Courage, mein kind. Even in a cage, a bird may sing. But not all lessons end gently, and not all bonds survive the crown they help create. Because the same governess who taught the princess to be independent would one day learn what happens when that independence no longer needs you. When the crown finally came, it didn't arrive with trumpets, at least not for Victoria. It came with a knock on her bedroom door at 5 a.m. She was 18, groggy, barefoot, wrapped in a dressing gown, when they told her the king was dead. "You are now the queen." She later wrote, "I was quite calm." History, ever dramatic, prefers to remember that moment as the birth of confidence, but really it was the birth of solitude. Because when you become queen at 18, you don't just inherit a kingdom, you inherit the right to be very, very alone. And so, when the world shifted beneath her feet, she reached instinctively for the one hand that had never let go. Louise Lehzen's. Lehzen was still there, no longer governess, but trusted companion, advisor, household overseer. The same woman who had watched over her schooling now watched over her court, fiercely protective, sharp as ever. The politicians bowed, the courtiers flattered, Lehzen scolded. When Victoria fretted about protocol, Lehzen said, "You are the queen, mein kind. Protocol frets about you." When ministers pressed her to marry, Lehzen sniffed, "A husband will expect obedience. And you have had quite enough of that." To the outside world, Lehzen was a relic of the old Kensington years. An unbending German matron in black, her accent thick as porridge. But to Victoria, she was the only remnant of childhood she trusted. In the early years of her reign, they were inseparable. Lehzen managed the household, chose staff, oversaw correspondence, and occasionally scolded senior lords for incompetence. The Prime Minister himself once muttered that Lehzen rules the Queen's domestic affairs as if she were mistress of the house. He wasn't wrong. When Victoria fell ill, Lehzen administered her medicine. When she quarreled with her mother, Lehzen soothed her temper. And when the weight of power threatened to smother her, Lehzen's dry humor kept her sane. Imagine the sight. The Queen of England, barely 5 feet tall, sitting by the fire with her old governess, complaining about the tedium of audiences and paperwork, and Lehzen, unflinching, saying, "You wish to be queen. Queens do not sulk." It was, in its way, a friendship as strange and profound as any in her life. But then, as happens in all good stories, another presence entered. Handsome, idealistic, inconveniently perfect, Prince Albert. He arrived from Germany in 1839, earnest and serious, armed with moral principles and an alarming fondness for organization. Victoria, swept up in a storm of admiration and affection, proposed to him herself. It was love, genuine, fierce, impulsive. And yet, from the moment he entered her life, the room seemed to shrink. Lehzen had ruled that private world for nearly 2 decades, and she did not intend to surrender it easily. Albert, meanwhile, had been raised to believe that a wife's household was her husband's domain. The idea that an aging governess was effectively running the royal household made his tidy German sensibilities twitch. He distrusted Lehzen immediately. He found her domineering, secretive, and, worst of all, dismissive of him. Letters between Albert and his advisor, Baron Stockmar, reveal his irritation in excruciating detail. "The Queen," he complained, "is surrounded by persons who feed her pride and keep her a stranger to reason." And by persons, he meant Lehzen. He accused her of mismanaging the nursery, overspending, meddling in affairs that weren't hers. To be fair, she probably did all of those things, but out of loyalty, not malice. Lehzen, for her part, regarded Albert as an intruder. Polite, yes, but far too sure of himself. She didn't like his control over the Queen's time or his insistence on efficiency over affection. Once, when Albert questioned the appointment of a servant, Lehzen reportedly snapped, "This household has run perfectly well without your advice, sir." That went down about as well as you'd expect. The tension grew quietly, day by day, under the gilt ceilings of Buckingham Palace. Victoria, caught between the two people she loved most, tried desperately to keep the peace. She defended Lehzen to Albert, and Albert to Lehzen, until it became clear she could not please them both. To her, Lehzen represented comfort, the safety of childhood, the security of being cared for. To Albert, she represented chaos, an untidy emotional relic from a less dignified era. Eventually, the breaking point came over a matter of illness. The royal children had fallen sick. Albert blamed the nursery's mismanagement, which Lehzen oversaw. He confronted Victoria, firmly, rationally, devastatingly, and insisted something had to change. For once, the Queen could not argue. In her diary, she wrote simply, "The whole thing is very painful to me." She didn't elaborate, but her meaning was clear. Lehzen's time was ending. It was not a grand dismissal. There were no shouts, no accusations, just a conversation. Quiet, heavy, inevitable. "Dearest Lehzen," the Queen began, "it has been decided." Lehzen, ever dignified, replied, "As your Majesty wishes." She packed her belongings, books, letters, mementos, and returned to Germany. The Queen wept when she left. She wrote to Albert the next day, "It is over, and I am sure it is for the best. But I am so very sad." In truth, it was more than sadness. It was the end of an era, the final severing of the cord between Victoria the child and Victoria the Queen. Lehzen had given her courage, discipline, and independence, but in doing so had taught her how to stand alone. And now, inevitably, she stood alone indeed. For the rest of her life, Victoria remembered her with affection. "She was devoted," she wrote, "and I owe her much." And she did owe her much, because in the shadows of those early years, before the crown, before Albert, before the empire, it was Lehzen who had shaped her into something the world could never quite control. Love and loyalty, power and pain, all stitched together by one woman's devotion. When the Queen looked in the mirror after Lehzen's departure, she saw for the first time not a pupil, but a monarch. The cost of that reflection was heartbreak, but the reward was sovereignty. And that, dear dreamer, is the quiet tragedy of love built on guidance. One day, you must let go of the hand that taught you how to walk. And if you're still here, walking beside these stories, Don't leave them behind like the world once did. Go on. Subscribe before they fade back into silence. When Lehzen left Buckingham Palace in 1842, it felt, to the Queen, like a chapter quietly torn from her own life. There was no grand farewell, no official mention in the court circulars. No one wrote newspaper tributes or printed portraits. Just a governess, once the most powerful woman in Victoria's private world, returning to the land she had come from, carrying a few trunks, a heart full of pride, and a silence that only letters would later fill. Louise Lehzen went home to Hanover, to a modest house near the palace gardens. She was 55 then, a stern, sharp-featured woman with a spine like an exclamation mark and a heart she tried her best to pretend wasn't broken. For all her iron discipline, she had loved that girl, her dear little Drina, with a devotion that had nothing to do with duty. And now, suddenly, her days were empty. No lessons to give, no reports to write, no princess to protect from scheming courtiers or overbearing mothers. In her letters to friends, she called it retirement. But it wasn't really rest. It was exile, wrapped in politeness. Still, she refused to wallow. Lehzen was nothing if not practical. She filled her days with books, embroidery, correspondence, and long walks in the Hanover gardens. She had a housekeeper, a cat, and a stubborn sense of dignity that refused to fade. Visitors often remarked that she spoke of England rarely, but when she did, her whole face softened, and she never stopped writing to Victoria. Their correspondence stretched for decades, slow, steady, and deeply personal. Lehzen's letters were full of simple details: the weather, her garden, her ailments. Victoria's, by contrast, were a blend of affection and monarchy, part diary, part state report. She wrote of her children, her travels, her joys and frustrations, and always she signed off the same way. Your most affectionate, grateful, and devoted Victoria R. Sometimes she would add, I long to see you once again, my dearest good Lehzen. They never did see each other again. For all the Queen's power, some things remain impossible to command, and the comfort of old friendship is one of them. It's tempting to imagine the two women in their separate worlds. Victoria, now a mother of 9, surrounded by courtiers and papers, her days filled with noise and duty, and Lehzen, alone in Hanover, sitting by a window, the evening light turning her knitting needles to silver, reading one of the Queen's letters aloud in her still strong German accent. Perhaps she smiled when she reached the familiar closing line. I shall ever love her, because despite everything, the dismissal, the distance, the silence of years, that love had never really changed its shape. It had simply grown quieter, the way affection does when words no longer need to explain it. The Queen's diary still mentioned her, occasionally and fondly. My dear good Lehzen, she wrote in 1861, who was so devoted to me. That year, the year Albert died, Victoria found herself once again leaning on the habits Lehzen had built in her long ago: discipline, endurance, faith in her own strength. Even in grief, the Queen could hear her old governess's voice. Courage, minkind. When Lehzen's health began to decline, her letters grew shorter, shakier. She apologized for her handwriting, which trembled with age. She sent blessings for the Queen's children. And then, finally, one day, her pen fell silent. Louise Lehzen died in 1870 at 83 years old, quietly, privately, without fanfare. The Queen received the news weeks later. She said nothing publicly, but in her journal she wrote, My dear good Lehzen is gone. I shall ever love her. 6 words, and an entire lifetime folded within them. No state mourning, no marble monument, just love, plain and unembellished, written in a hand that had once held Lehzen's as a child. It's strange, isn't it? How the people who shape us most often disappear from history's stage without applause. But their fingerprints remain. You can see Lehzen's, faint but firm, all through Victoria's life, in her insistence on order, in her unyielding sense of self, in her habit of writing everything down as if the act of recording life gave it meaning. Even her devotion to duty, the thing the Victorians admired most, was something she learned not from kings or ministers, but from a woman with a German accent who once told her, "Do right and fear no one." That was Lehzen's legacy. Not glory, not fame, just the quiet courage to stand alone when it mattered. And perhaps that's why, even in old age, the Queen sometimes slipped and said "we" when she meant "I." Not because of royal pluralism, but because somewhere in her heart, she never stopped thinking of the two of them as a team, the teacher and the pupil, the child and her shadow. History loves to imagine that power makes people strong, but for Victoria, it wasn't power that made her strong. It was being loved, once, by someone who demanded nothing in return. So, when you think of the Queen in her black dresses, the Empress of India commanding half the world, remember that beneath the lace and medals was still that girl from Kensington, the one who had learned, long ago, how to keep her head high, how to hide her tears, and how to keep walking even when her shoes pinched. Because once upon a time, in a quiet nursery, a voice had told her she could, and that voice, though long gone, never really stopped echoing. Years later, another woman would fill that empty space, one who tended the Queen's chamber, not her conscience. Where Lehzen shaped her youth, Annie MacDonald would guard her twilight. By the time Annie MacDonald entered the Queen's service, the story of Victoria's life had already been written in loss. She had been daughter, queen, wife, widow. She had survived ministers, revolutions, wars, and more family scandals than she cared to count. She had known passion, loyalty, betrayal, and the long ache of absence. And then came Annie. Born in 1832, in the rugged countryside near Balmoral, Annie MacDonald was not a woman of titles or fortune. She began, quite literally, with her sleeves rolled up, a washerwoman in the royal laundry, scrubbing linen until her hands turned red from the cold Scottish water. But she was reliable, diligent, and, most importantly, unflappable. She had that rare kind of calm that can't be taught. You could set a castle on fire behind her, and she'd still finish folding the towels before looking up. It wasn't long before she was noticed. In 1862, the same year the Queen was drowning in grief after Albert's death, Annie was promoted to principal dresser, the highest position in the royal wardrobe staff. And so, as the Queen of half the world sat in her black mourning clothes, her new dresser quietly took up the role that would define her life, not as a servant of fabric, but as a guardian of peace. Annie MacDonald was not glamorous, nor especially talkative. She was short, sturdy, and built like someone who'd won more arguments with weather than with people. Her colleagues said she had the patience of stone. Her friends said she had the good sense of the Highlands. The Queen said simply, "She is always near and always true." It was not the sort of compliment history prints in gold, but it was the kind Victoria saved for the few who deserved it. Annie's world was small, but it was constant. She oversaw the Queen's wardrobe, yes, but that meant far more than buttons and lace. She laid out mourning veils, folded shawls, prepared fresh gloves for audiences, and waited quietly in an adjoining room during sleepless nights. If Brown had brought the Queen laughter, and Karim had brought her curiosity, Annie brought something rarer still: peace. There was a steadiness about her, a groundedness born from the hills she came from. The Queen trusted her completely, enough to speak freely, even on days when words failed. When Victoria's knees began to ache, Annie would fuss over her cushions. When her writing hand trembled, Annie fetched the pen rest. When her grief returned, Annie sat silently by the hearth until the tears stopped. She didn't try to console her with platitudes or philosophy. She didn't try to fill the silence. She simply stayed, as she always had, and in a way, that was her genius. Because by now the Queen didn't need another confidant or advisor or teacher. She had had enough of those: Brown, Karim, Lehzen, Skerrett, all gone. What she needed was presence. Someone who wouldn't question her moods, wouldn't judge her rituals, wouldn't demand a thing. Annie provided that. A quiet figure at the edge of the lamplight, always ready, never intrusive. The Queen's later diaries mention her only in passing, brief notes, matter-of-fact, yet deeply affectionate. Dear Annie, most attentive. A very sad day. Annie, most kind. The best comfort I have. In those sparse words, you can hear the exhaustion of age and the quiet gratitude of someone who has run out of words for loyalty. By the 1870s and 1880s, Annie had become part of the Queen's daily rhythm. She managed her dressing, her travel trunks, her private belongings. She was there in Windsor, Osborne, Balmoral. Wherever the Queen went, Annie followed. The household joked that Her Majesty and her dresser travel as one. And there's something touching in that image. A monarch who once commanded empires, now relying most upon a woman who hemmed her gowns and warmed her shawls. Annie's own story rarely breaks the surface of history's pond, but every ripple of her presence is visible in the Queen's later life. She steadied her through illness, loneliness, and the endless demands of duty. She was the constant in a life built on impermanence. And perhaps most beautifully, she was from Scotland, the land that had healed Victoria once before. The Queen often said that Balmoral was my dear paradise in the Highlands, and perhaps it's no coincidence that two of her deepest human bonds, John Brown and Annie MacDonald, came from its soil. Where Brown had carried her back into life after Albert's death, Annie carried her through the long, quiet decades that followed, not with force or passion, but with gentleness. It's easy to imagine the two of them in those late years at Balmoral, the Queen, wrapped in shawls, sitting by the window with her journal. Annie, darning stockings nearby, humming an old Gaelic tune under her breath. Outside, the heather swaying, the hills rolling in soft twilight. The world might have seen a lonely old monarch, but in truth, she was rarely alone. And for all the opulence of her rooms, the chandeliers, the gold frames, the velvet, it was the sound of Annie's quiet footsteps, the rustle of her skirts, the simple word, "ma'am," that made the Queen feel at home. Annie MacDonald served Victoria faithfully until the very end. She was there through illness and recovery, through holidays and mourning, through the quiet hum of years that few remember, but the Queen cherished most. When people asked what made her so indispensable, one chamberlain answered, "Because Her Majesty never has to ask twice." There's a peculiar grace in that kind of devotion. No grand speeches, no gestures, just a life spent in small, perfect attentions. And perhaps that's why Victoria trusted her more than most ministers or princes. She knew that Annie's loyalty wasn't born of ambition. It was born of care. If Lehzen had shaped the Queen's will, and Skerrett had steadied her youth, and Brown had revived her heart, and Karim had stirred her curiosity, then Annie was the final note in the melody, the quiet hum that carries the tune long after the music has ended. And in that stillness, in the soft lamplight of those late evenings, the Queen found what she had sought all her life. Not adoration, not instruction, not devotion, but simple companionship. Someone who stayed. The Scottish hills that once held Brown now cradle Annie, the same steadfast earth, the same quiet loyalty. And for a queen who had known so many kinds of love, this final one was the gentlest. The peace of being watched over and not worshipped. If you had walked the corridors of Osborne House or Windsor Castle in the last decades of the 19th century, long after the grandeur had faded and the Queen's world had slowed to a quiet, steady rhythm, you would have seen her, not the Queen herself, though she was never far away. You would have seen a small, purposeful woman in plain black, moving through the palace with that particular kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. That was Annie MacDonald, principal dresser to Her Majesty the Queen. To the untrained eye, she might have looked like any other servant, unadorned, efficient, discreet. But in truth, Annie occupied one of the most intimate positions in the entire royal household. She had been there since 1862, and by the 1890s that meant more than 40 years at the Queen's side. She had unpacked royal trunks in half a dozen palaces, tended wardrobes on trains and steamships, and slept in adjoining rooms for so long that she could tell which shawl the Queen wanted just by the sound of her sigh. It's said that routine is the heartbeat of monarchy, and Annie was its quiet pulse. Her job, technically, was to manage the Queen's clothes. But that description is a little like saying the ocean manages water. It doesn't begin to cover the depth of it. Each day, Annie oversaw the selection, pressing, and repair of dozens of garments. She arranged the jewelry cases, counted the ribbons, logged the accessories. And when the Queen traveled, which she did constantly between Windsor, Osborne, Balmoral, and occasionally the continent, Annie supervised the packing of entire wardrobes, black dresses, gray dresses, widow's veils, gloves, bonnets, parasols, fans, all catalogued with precision that would make an archivist weep with admiration. She knew which hemlines trailed too long, which sashes irritated the Queen's temper, which fabrics made her sneeze. She was, in a sense, the custodian of comfort and of dignity. But beyond the linens and lace, Annie guarded something far more fragile, the Queen's privacy. She was there in the mornings when Victoria's joints ached and her spirits were low. She was there in the evenings when the palace grew still, and the Queen sat by the fire writing letters to the ghosts of her past, to Albert, to Brown, to Lehzen. Annie would quietly pour her tea, adjust a cushion, or fetch another log for the fire, all without a word. She knew that silence, in the Queen's later years, was the most precious kindness of all. And the Queen trusted her completely. In one of her notes, Victoria called Annie absolutely devoted, and the best comfort I have. That phrase may sound small, but in royal language it is monumental. The Queen, who had outlived nearly everyone she loved, no longer used the word friend lightly. To be the best comfort meant more than affection. It meant constancy, faithfulness, the luxury of someone who would never leave. The two women shared the kind of unspoken understanding that grows only through time. Annie could sense the Queen's moods before a word was said. When Victoria's grief for Albert resurfaced, which it often did, Annie didn't try to console her with talk of heaven or duty. She simply straightened her veil, placed a hand on the Queen's arm, and said softly, "It's all right, ma'am. He's near." And somehow it helped. Annie had a gift for being both invisible and indispensable, an art few could master. Courtiers respected her, ministers deferred to her, and even the Queen's children treated her with wary reverence. The Princess of Wales once called her terribly formidable for a woman so quiet. She was, after all, the only person who could knock on the Queen's door at any hour without permission, and she did, every night. Because Annie's duties didn't end with the wardrobe. In later years, she became the Queen's unofficial watcher, the one who kept vigil through the night in the adjoining room, listening for the bell that meant Her Majesty couldn't sleep, or needed help turning in bed, or wanted her reading lamp adjusted by half an inch. It was an odd sort of companionship. Part service, part friendship, part guardianship. A life spent in the periphery of power, close enough to touch it, but never claiming any of it for herself. And yet, if you'd asked Victoria in those years whom she trusted most, Annie's name would have come first. Not her ministers, not her doctors, not her children. Annie. Perhaps because Annie never asked for anything. Not favor, not attention, not thanks. She served quietly, steadily, as though the rhythm of the Queen's days were a hymn she had memorized long ago. And through it all, the aging, the ailments, the endless duties, she remained exactly as she had always been. Calm, sensible, unshakably loyal. There's something deeply comforting in that image, isn't there? A queen surrounded by the chaos of empire and the ghosts of her own history, anchored by one ordinary woman who refused to be moved by any of it. When the Queen laughed, Annie smiled. When she wept, Annie waited. When she drifted off to sleep, Annie took her place in the small adjoining room, the door open just a crack, the lamp burning low. Decades passed that way, one life orbiting another in quiet devotion. And if that sounds like servitude, it was. But it was also love. Not the kind that writes poetry or demands monuments, but the kind that endures. Because not all great romances are romantic. Some are simply two lives stitched together by habit, care, and trust. 41 years of mornings and nights, of dressing gowns and patience, of words unspoken but perfectly understood. Annie MacDonald had seen the Queen through her private world. Grief, laughter, indignation, the fatigue of age. She had witnessed the woman behind the monarchy, the one history rarely gets to meet. And through it all, she had remained what she'd always been, the watcher. For the Queen, whose life had been a tapestry of love and loss, Annie was the final thread, plain, durable, and true. Because sometimes, dear dreamer, the most extraordinary devotion is the one that asks for nothing in return, only the privilege to stay until the end. By the late 1890s, the Queen's world had grown very small. The great empire she once ruled still stretched across maps in bold red ink, but her own circle had narrowed to a few rooms, a few faces, and one constant: the steady presence of Annie MacDonald. For 41 years, Annie had lived her life in rhythm with the Queen's, dressing, preparing, fetching, waiting, listening, always there, always near. But even constancy, like candles, has an end. In 1897, the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, the grand celebration of 60 years on the throne, Annie's health began to fail. She had grown frail, her breath shallow, her movements slower. The years of travel and long nights had worn her body thin. The doctors called it a wasting condition. The Queen called it my poor Annie being worn out. And perhaps that's what it was, the quiet exhaustion of a life spent in service, of carrying another person's comfort for so long that your own strength slowly ebbs away. Annie tried to keep working. She insisted on preparing the Queen's rooms, folding her shawls, even when her hands trembled. But the Queen, ever watchful now, would stop her. "No, no, my dear Annie," she would say, in that soft voice age had turned to a murmur. "You must rest. I insist." Rest, of course, was the one command Annie had never obeyed easily. She had spent a lifetime answering bells and footsteps. Silence was foreign to her. So when she finally took to her bed, she did so with quiet reluctance, asking only that her room remain close to the Queen's. "In case Her Majesty should need anything," she said, as if even dying might be delayed by duty. The Queen visited often. She would sit by Annie's bed, holding her hand, the way she had once held the hands of so many who had gone before. Her entries in her journal from those days are simple, heartbreakingly restrained. "My faithful Annie very ill. I am most anxious. It grieves me much to see her suffer. Dear Annie, I fear I must lose her." And then, on a quiet autumn morning in October 1897, Annie MacDonald slipped away. No crowds, no ceremony, no royal salute. Just a woman who had given her life in quiet devotion, leaving it in the same silence in which she had served. When the news came, the Queen wept. She did not attend the funeral. Monarchs never did. But she sent flowers and wrote a letter that simply said, "I have lost a real friend." A real friend. Not servant, not subject, not dresser. Friend. For someone who had spent most of her life surrounded by people paid to care, that word meant more than titles or honors ever could. She ordered a small memorial cross for Annie's grave, placed near Balmoral, among the same hills that had once shaped her. It bore no grand inscription, only her name, dates, and a simple line in the Queen's own words, "Faithful and beloved." And with that, one of the quietest chapters in Victoria's life came to an end. Yet, in a sense, their story didn't end there. Not really, because Annie's absence left behind a silence that no one could fill. The Queen still had attendants, efficient, dutiful, polite, but they were not Annie. She noticed it in the smallest things, the unfamiliar way someone laid out her gloves, the echo in the chamber where Annie's footstep used to fall, the way no one else ever thought to bring her shawl before she asked. In her final years, the Queen often spoke of Annie. "Dear MacDonald," she would say, sometimes to no one in particular. So faithful, so dear. And her diary, those endless volumes she had kept since girlhood, begin to take on a different tone. Gone are the fiery opinions, the judgments, the bursts of temper. What remains is gentleness, reflection, and a soft gratitude. The last entries of her life, written in January 1901, read almost like a prayer to herself. "I feel weak, but calm. All has been done faithfully. God's will be done." There is no mention of regret, no talk of crowns or politics. Only the quiet satisfaction of a life lived and of devotion returned. She passed away on January 22nd, 1901 at Osborne House, the same home where Annie had tended her so many nights before. Those who were there said the Queen seemed serene, as if she were simply falling asleep. On her bedside table were two familiar objects, a photograph of Prince Albert and a small lock of John Brown's hair, but tucked within her coffin, placed there by her request, was something else. a ring, a handkerchief, and a few cherished tokens of those who had served her with love. Among them, a piece of cloth embroidered by Annie MacDonald. Even in death she took their loyalty with her. Two women bound not by blood or title, but by time. By 40 years of shared silence, soft voices, and the kind of trust history rarely notices. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it still. The quiet rustle of fabric, the turn of a page, the gentle murmur of, "It's all ready, ma'am." For all her power, Queen Victoria's truest legacy wasn't her empire. It was her humanity, preserved by those who stayed near when the rest of the world only bowed. Annie MacDonald may never have ruled, but she mastered something far harder: how to serve without disappearing, how to love without demanding, how to endure without applause. In the end, the Queen and her dresser shared the same peace, not in glory, but in stillness. The curtain falls softly, the palace grows quiet, and two lives, one royal, one ordinary, finally rest in the same silence they shared for so many years. History loves its crowns, the gleam, the gold, the grandeur. But crowns, dear dreamer, are cold things. It's candles that make a kingdom warm. And around Queen Victoria, 5 such candles once burned. Quietly, steadily, unseen by the world that only looked for light in the wrong places. John Brown, the flame, fierce, scandalous, impossible to ignore. He dared to speak to the Queen as a woman, not a monument. His loyalty was rough, real, and ungovernable. Abdul Karim, the mirror, reflecting back to Victoria a world she never knew, teaching her language, faith, and humility. His presence forced an empire to confront its own prejudice, a quiet revolution wrapped in silk. Marianne Skerrett, the hearth, the calm heartbeat of the palace, folding ribbons while history thundered outside the window. She built her queen's comfort from order, steadiness, and care, the gentle defiance of devotion. Louise Lehzen, the root, the stern governess who raised a monarch from a frightened child. She taught courage, discipline, the art of solitude, the unseen scaffolding that held the woman behind the crown. And Annie MacDonald, the quiet dusk, 40 years of watchfulness, tending the Queen's final light. She didn't need words or rewards, only the peace of staying near until the last night fell. 5 lives, 5 threads, all woven into one vast tapestry of devotion. They were the pulse behind the pageantry, the hands behind the history books. And perhaps that's the truest measure of power. Not how many bow before you, but how many stand beside you when the world falls silent. So, as you drift tonight, remember them, the ones history forgot, though they shape the heartbeat of an empire. Remember that behind every crown, there's always a candle. And if this story kept you company tonight, if these voices found you in the quiet, don't let them fade like all the others did. Go on, subscribe, and let history keep whispering you to sleep. Because when you do, you're not just keeping me company, you're keeping them alive.